Hello, welcome to the first unit in CIS 3048, C# programming. This is a two-part course. Each course is worth 2 credits, and they go together fairly well. We'll bridge from one to the other. We'll be looking at C# and programming. We'll focus both on Windows Forms and ASP, active server pages, which is a type of web page. Our text we'll be using is beginning ASP.NET 4.5 and C#. We'll be using this text and I'll be supplementing it with some resources for Windows Forms. And we'll create a lot of applications both in Windows Forms and in active server pages and web pages. There's no PowerPoints that go along with this text, so I will just walk you through the electronic version of this text a little bit at the start of each chapter. So one thing I would like to point out in the introduction is the code samples. So in the introduction you have a link to the code samples. You can go here and download all the code samples. Starting with chapter 3, there are some more complicated examples and they get even more complicated. So I would suggest if you have a chance, go to this website and download the code examples for this book. It just will save you typing while in later on. Okay, let's start with the first chapter, the big picture. We'll be using .NET here and Microsoft Visual Studio for creating .NET applications. And we'll be using the C# languages. There are basically 2 languages that are pretty well interchangeable, C# and Visual Basic, and they can do very similar features. We'll be just using C# in this place. Talks a little bit about web page creation, goes over the basics of HTML. You should know basic HTML if you don't already. Things like tags, start tags, end tags, start tags and end tags, and how to read kind of basic HTML. I'll provide some resources, some links to resources on learning basic HTML. So if you haven't learned it, you should spend an hour or 2 reviewing the basics of HTML at the start of this class. We won't be doing anything complicated in HTML, but you should be able to read through a basic page. So here's the web page they have laid out, and they also talk about a web form here. We will be doing web forms a little bit, so they use a form tag, and then they have a couple different input boxes, check boxes here, and a submit button. Again, we won't be looking always at the HTML. Sometimes we'll be using a visual designer to lay out these types of forms also. But again, you should be just familiar enough so you can read through this and kind of understand how that can create a form like this, a web page like this. Talk a little bit about ASP.NET active server pages, our version of web pages, and they generally run on the server side, so that means they run on the server rather than a client side. You can do client side programming, but more often client side programming is done with JavaScript code, which runs on the client, so on your web browser. So this quick overview on server-side web application. If you're at a PC, wow, this is an old-looking PC. If you're at your PC and you're viewing a web page, we request that web page to a server, a web server, and that web server sends the HTML document to us, and then it's displayed on our browser here. Now with active server pages, we will run the web page we request will have code associated with that, and the code will run on the server, and then that server will create an HTML page that will be delivered back to our client. So all the code is run on the server. That's why we call it server-side programming. Gives us nice access. So when we have to access large databases and stuff, that's all done on server-side programming. So most of the big websites are at everything from Facebook to Amazon to like a Gmail account. All those that access data on a server, those are all run with server-side applications, and that's what we'll be using. Now, there are also client-side programs or scripting you can do, like JavaScript, and there we grab a web page from the server with some embedded code in it, and then we run that. So client side is more like simple error checking or simple things, interface examples that run on the web page to make it look and appear differently. Again, this isn't a web design course or whatever, so we won't be talking too much more in detail about the server side or client side application. So, now the .NET framework, just a quick overview on something called Common Language Runtime, CLR. So there are a couple different languages that you can program in, but the main two are C# and Visual Basic. That a lot of people use for creating this sort of Windows app or Windows Forms. And basic structure that we'll be working with is we'll be looking at web forms and Windows forms. We'll be creating some ASP pages. They'll be called web forms or ASP pages, and some Windows forms. So Windows forms will be applications that will run on Windows, and web forms will be running on the actual website, and these will be the server-side program. So we'll be creating a lot of our applications in both, so we can see both. We'll be also accessing some of these other libraries. In particular, we'll be using the ADO.NET. So ASP is Active Server Pages, and that's a type of web page. ADO is data access, and we'll be using that to access different databases on our server. And we won't be getting to that until the second part of this course, the CIS 3049 part of that course. And we'll talk about some of these other libraries then. So the Common Runtime library, let's talk a little bit about that. These programs are written in like C#, and then they're compiled down to a intermediate language, which is this Microsoft calls the intermediate language, IL. So here's a little diagram that shows what's kind of going on. We will write source code in C#. It'll be compiled into an intermediate language, and then that will run. That's basically our executable, but it is somewhat machine independent in the fact that when we actually then run that on a machine, that intermediate language is compiled again. So again, it's hard to say if this is compiled or not. So we compile down to one level of language, and then we use a just-in-time compiler when we run the program to convert it into the native language of our machine. This is not dissimilar to what Java does and this sort of framework. So what that does is create executables that are somewhat flexible in what applications they will run on. So just all I want you to be familiar with here is just intermediate language is this language which our source code is compiled to, and then we have this common language runtime, CLR, which is the system that runs the actual programs from then on. So that's a basic overview. You can read through this descriptions also. We'll be using Visual Studio to do a lot of our work. I'll be using Visual Studio 2012. There are a couple different versions. There's an Express version, which is free to everyone. But you also, as a Science Classic student, we're part of the the Microsoft Academic Alliance, and through that we have free access for students to the more advanced ones. So we can be running things like Visual Studio Professional and be doing that. So I'll make sure I have pointers to resources for downloading and setting that up. Again, you're welcome to just run the Express version. That's fine for what we're doing, but you can also download this full Visual Studio Professional. So that's a quick introduction, and the next chapter is going to talk about the C# language, and that'll be in Unit 2.